and welcome to another session of CSPC Virtual Series. Today we have a very exciting session titled Canada's R&D Innovation System in a Post-COVID-19 World. The presentation is an analysis of the federal government programs costing us $342 billion to respond to the pandemic, as well as an examination of the impact of COVID-19 on governments, universities, colleges, businesses, households, and global markets. And will include a discussion of the yesterday's September 23rd speech from the throne. And who is doing that? Dave Waters, who is the founder and president and CEO of the Global Advantage Consulting Group. And he's no stranger to this audience, but before reading his bio, let me indicate that our program today, we are pleased to have two other discussants to provide comments from a different perspectives to Dave's analysis. Karen Greve, Chief Executive Officer of Futurpreneur, and Irene Sterian, founder and CEO of Manufacturing Acceleration Process Network, or REMAP. And on the presentation, helping Dave with his presentation, Omar Kaya, my apologies, Global Advantage Associated Partner. And without any further ado, let's go to Dave's bio and his presentation. Dave Waters, of course, will talk for about 45 minutes. And after that, two discussants will present for 15 minutes in total, their comments. And then we go to Q&A, where you have the time and opportunity to ask your questions. And so Dave Waters, as I mentioned, no stranger to this community for his deep and accurate and systematic analysis of the ecosystem, innovation ecosystems, and science and technology around the world. Dave Waters is the founder and president of Global Advantage Consulting Group. At the firm, he completed over 500 assignments in Canada and abroad, and providing advice to corporate associations, university, governments, clients, primarily in the areas of R&D, new technology, development, innovation, commercialization, economic development, and trade. Prior to the creation of Global Advantage, Dave pursued a 30-year career in Government of Canada, including Assistant Deputy Minister positions in Industry Canada, Treasury Board, and Finance Canada. As the Assistant Deputy Minister at Finance Canada for Economic Development and Corporate Finance, he helped shape Canada's economic and innovation investments. Dave is also sit on the CSPC Board of Directors, and we are pleased to have him and within our team, and always benefit for his very wise advice and on numerous issues. And helping with him today, Omar Kaya, Global Advantage Associate Partner. Omar holds an MA in European Studies from Carleton University as part of the next generation who get into the analysis of innovation R&D ecosystem. Pleased to have you all with us. And I think without any further ado, we'll disappear from the stage or virtual stage and giving the stage solely to Dave Waters for his presentation. And thank you all for attending and taking time out of your busy schedule and being with us today. Dave, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mehrdad, for the very, very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today under the auspices of CSPC. Now, can we put the presentation on the screen? Terrific. Great. So I'm going to be talking about our Canadian R&D innovation system, and particularly, obviously, from the perspective of what we've been experiencing over these last 6 months. And I'll also introduce a component in terms of the speech from the throne. So next, please. We'll do it in 3 parts. So the first, again, we'll focus on the R&D innovation system. And I'm going to make an argument here that we have not been performing well, and we need to understand the nature of some of the challenges we're facing with that system, and it raises the question as to what we can do to improve it. In part 2, I'll look at the pandemic, look at the federal response to that pandemic, and I'll make the argument that absolutely understandable in terms of the approach I think that the Canadian government has taken and provincial governments. But with respect to the issue of economic development and innovation as part of economic development and research structures to support that, that there isn't very much there so far in terms of the plans that the government has put into place, but maybe there's a foundation for the future. The third part we'll look at then is a sustainable economic growth and job strategy, and whether or not the new directions in the speech from the throne are going to support that direction of economic growth. I'm going to argue that I don't think there is a lot there. I think that we actually do need a new R&D and innovation strategy, but it should be linked into the key sectors of the Canadian economy. It should be linked into a trade strategy, and it should be linked into a skill strategy. So all four should be integrated together in order to really stimulate the economy as we begin to emerge from COVID-19. Next slide, please. And the slide after that. So let's look at the global R&D context. You'll see Canada with a little maple leaf flag in the middle of this particular slide. And what this shows is the global context for research and development. On the horizontal axis at the bottom, you'll see that each of the countries is represented in terms of how much of its economic activity is devoted to research and development. So this is like a race, and those in the far right are winning the race. So you've got South Korea in the lead, you've got Israel, Japan, United States doing well, Germany, and so on and so forth. You even have China that has actually emerged ahead of Canada now in terms of what support it's using from its economy to devote to research and development. The size of the bubbles is the total amount of money that is being spent. So Canada spends ballpark about $35 billion. This is about 1.5% of the total that is being spent on a worldwide basis. And it raises issues about, since we're really not even quite in the middle of the pack, we're a little bit behind now, are we doing enough? Do we want to do more in terms of the priority that we give to research and development in this country and innovation? Next slide. Here we actually look at the details of where Canada is actually investing in research and development. On the top line, you have the 6 sources of R&D funding, and you have the major components from the business sector, higher education, actually foreign governments doing research and development here, and the federal government. However, when you look at the line below that, the performers, the 4 performers of research and development, you can see that there are really only 2. Provinces actually don't do much R&D. Federal government does R&D mostly for regulatory purposes and some other investments such as in Agriculture Canada and so on. But the 2 primary conductors of research and development are the higher education and the business sector. And of course, in Canada, the key issue is how are we getting the new knowledge from the higher education sector into the business sector. Next. Here you have a couple of statements that I think are important. The first is the function of research is to acquire new knowledge. So whenever I see the word research and development, I automatically translate it into new knowledge. What new knowledge is being developed by Canadian institutions? And I think that the general sense is we're actually quite good at producing new knowledge, but when you come to the use of that new knowledge, time and time again, Canadian studies, and even ISED has acknowledged that we're not very good at it. We're not very good at taking the results of that knowledge and making it productive for the use of our citizens. You have below that then, I think, this excellent summary from Kevin Lynch, who was the Clerk of the Privy Council and Deputy Minister of Finance. Research is the process that turns money into knowledge. Innovation is the process that turns knowledge into wealth. And that component, if you go to the next slide, please, is the one that I think is important. So here you have a linkage between the funders of new knowledge, the creators of new knowledge, and the creators of wealth. It is only the private sector that creates wealth when they sell domestically and they sell into global markets. And I think then we need to look at the structure of our innovation system from the perspective of how well are we getting new knowledge into the private sector, into goods and services that are then getting into global markets. Next slide, please. Here's the summary of Canadian performance. It's been updated with the latest OECD data. And it shows that while we were very close to the OECD average going back to 2004, basically over a decade and a half with one or two very minor blips, we're on a downward trend, and we continue on that downward trend. There really is a huge gap now between how Canada is performing in terms of the resources it's putting into research and development and how what the OECD average is. That gap is now about $18 billion for Canada. So go to the next slide, please. Here you have on the left-hand side that same depiction. You have some of the international assessments of Canada's performance. I think you're all quite familiar with these. We really don't do very well. So we're 36% below the OECD average. In terms of business expenditures in R&D, about 50% below. So we only spend half of what other business sectors spend on research and development. On the education side, reverse side, we're about 59% above the OECD average. And we still have this persistent problem of the difficulty of turning research and development results into innovation outputs. And in fact, that GII index, if you see there, you've got the latest study from the World Intellectual Property Organization in Cornell, that Canada actually doesn't do bad in terms of inputs. It's on generating outputs that we actually are failing. Turn to the next slide. Here we have a comparison of the Canadian performance, ballpark about 35 billion. And if we were to perform at the level of the OECD on average, we would need to spend another $18 billion. If we wanted to do better and perform at the level that the German economy performs, we would have to increase our expenditures on research and development by 32 billion. And then you've obviously got South Korea there as well. The issue is 18 billion, of course, is a lot of money, but it indicates how poorly we have been actually performing in terms of investing in research and development. Maybe there should be billions more for universities. Maybe there should be much more for colleges and institutes in terms of their research and development. Maybe we should look at special tax measures and other measures to support business research and development. So this indicates that how lacking we really are in terms of our performance, again, over a decade and a half. Next slide, please. Our performance is actually so bad that this was done about a year and a half ago in terms of looking at the inputs that Canada has supporting research and development and innovation, which are very high, and our outputs, which are quite low. When you look at this effectiveness ratio, we actually ranked 61st out of 120 countries. Countries that were ahead of us: Mongolia, Montenegro, Moldova, Malaysia, Malta, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. I think you kind of get the picture there. So the evidence is there that we just are not producing as a result of the great asset base that we have. And the question is, well, what more can we do? Next slide. One of the things that I think is a problem for us, this is a depiction in terms of how Canada's actual innovation performance, probably actually is. And yet the federal rhetoric that we constantly hear of Canada's innovation performance, I think is not helpful. The claims are that we're doing so extraordinarily well. We're a nation of innovators. We're not. And I think that before you can, it's like, Alcoholics Anonymous, before you can get better, you've got to acknowledge where you are and then decide, do we want to actually improve our performance? I think there's an intent to try and do that, but I think it begins by acknowledging that our performance has not been stellar, in fact, anything but. Next slide, please. This is the latest comprehensive study of the state of R&D in Canada, done by the Council of Canadian Academies, April 2018. Here were the 5 key areas of strength that it noted. Now, it set this within a context that we produce about 3.8% of the world's research, but it is declining from 7th to 9th spot. But the highlighted areas are psychology and cognitive science, visual performing arts, philosophy and theology, earth and environmental sciences, public health and services. Again, it noted, though, that we're not capturing the benefits of this. And in terms of the areas that we really are great at, you're not going to necessarily build much of economic activity from being excellent in philosophy and theology. There's nothing wrong with those particular sectors, but we're lacking performance in some of the harder edge sectors, you know, the natural sciences that are going to be so important for a modern economy. Next slide. These are other statements from the Council report. You know, again, as a leading performer of research is at risk due to this sustained slide that I demonstrated earlier in terms of the OECD data. We're not producing research at levels comparable to other leading countries on most enabling and strategic technologies. And we're less specialized and less esteemed in the core fields of the natural sciences and engineering. So again, here are Canadian reports pointing out the challenges that we're facing. Next slide, please. This is a study from Battelle Institute and the Research and Development magazine, which summarizes which countries have technology leadership. You have US and China, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, South Korea, UK there. In green, you have whether they are a leader, or in blue, whether you have you're a runner-up. The US, of course, is leading in about 9 of these key areas. And obviously, you'll note that Canada is nowhere to be identified in terms of that, that listing. Next slide, please. ICED, to its credit, did a very thorough summary and assessment of Canada's innovation performance. But one of the paragraphs that may have been overlooked in that particular report was this. And I think it's a warning. So to me, this is the warning like some of the earlier warnings about the virus that originated in Wuhan, and you had an indication that there was something there that was unusual one needed to look at. Well, here I think, you know, to its credit, ICED has published a report in which they said, without immediate and targeted action that builds upon existing strengths, addresses key gaps and weaknesses along the innovation continuum and drives growth, Canada will fall even further behind, putting its high quality of life at risk. I can't think of anything more direct that we should try and understand and address in terms of improving our performance of our innovation system. Next slide, please. I mentioned Germany as one of the outstanding performance in terms of its R&D innovation system. To me, this is just an impression of how it looks like in a competitive environment. Go to the next slide, please. To me, this is what the Canadian approach looks like. Do we invest enough? No. Do we have an R&D innovation target? No. Do we have sectoral targets? No, we don't. Are we improving the performance of our innovation system? Not that I can see. Do we claim to be a nation of innovators? Yes. And is this weird? Yes. I think we need to be realistic and address these issues which have been demonstrated by many, many organizations. Next slide, please. So that really finishes off. I just wanted to make the argument that I think we have a problem with our research and development innovation ecosystem. Many people have pointed this out. Even ICED has acknowledged it, Council of Canadian Academies, OECD. And we need to understand that and I think begin to address those challenges. But now let's look at the coronavirus and what kind of an impact it has had or may have on that system. Next slide, please. The impact of COVID-19. I was trying to look at an image that summarized this, and I picked on this one because this really hit like a shock wave around the globe. We all have our personal stories as to how our families and our employment and institutions that we work with were affected. And as a shock wave, you have the initial wave and then you have the repercussions of that coming out successively. I've tried to summarize this in terms of 3 uns, which I call the uneven impact of COVID-19. Clearly, it hit different countries at different rates in different times differently. It hit industries differently. So immediately it had an effect on the airline and the retail industry. It also had an enormous effect on women, affecting them more than I think any other segment of the population. It affected the elderly more than others, as we've seen in terms of the Canadian experience, and it affected youth more than others. In terms of an unraveling of assumptions, here it calls into question the role of government. We have seen government step in. I think the Canadian government, in my view, did a remarkable job in terms of responding to the coronavirus. It expanded its footprint in terms of the economy, and it expanded some of the areas that it felt were important to deal with, including some that arguably are more in the area of provincial responsibility. But we've also seen the unraveling of a whole range of other assumptions. We've seen a rise in nationalism. We've seen people question globalization. Is it really effective? We've seen a better understanding of supply chains affecting key products, and also including vaccines and therapeutic equipment and personal protective equipment and so on. And the final thing it's left it with in terms of waves of uncertainty is this unprecedented uncertainty. I know many of you have kids that are going back to school, some maybe in public school, some in high school, with different days in which they go back, different senses of online learning as opposed to in-person learning. We've had the uncertainty in terms of business expansion and operation. So really it's just a massive amount of uncertainty that is then causing every organization to reassess its strategy, including governments. And I would argue that we need to do this in terms of our research and development and innovation agenda. Next slide. Some of the fundamental changes then were working from home. We've seen increase in unemployment. And in the first month afterwards, there were 5.5 million Canadians that were affected. Over 30% of the Canadian population were either unemployed or were working only about 50% of the hours that they normally worked. The inequalities that I talked about were clearly exposed, particularly affecting the elderly, women, youth. Reduced travel and trade, the acceleration of a new digital world as we all had to scramble to get not only our households operating online, but to get our businesses operating online. This issue about the role of government. Huge amounts of debt. What impact will this have in future generations? We understand that we need to collaborate much better and have better models of collaboration in facing a common threat. We've got restructuring of education systems at all levels, primary, secondary, colleges, universities. I'm actually most worried about this particular area because we can't afford to lose a generation, in terms of the challenges we may have in supporting our educational systems. Redesign of cities as downtown cores were bare and vacant, and people were leaving, weren't going back actually in terms of these high-rise buildings, office structures, and so on. Risk identification, mitigation systems at a multilateral level becoming more important, and then of course the emergence of economic nationalism and angry populism. Go to the next slide, but then I think we'll just go beyond that. This is just a summary in terms of other impacts of COVID-19. If we can go to the economic response plan then. And here I'm going to turn it over to Omer to take us through the, I think, quite effective federal government response and provincial government responses to COVID-19. Omer?
All right, thank you, Dave. So you may want to start the video. So when we look at the government and the way the federal government organized for recovery, we have seen 80 new initiatives and creation of new committees in a pretty short period of time. And these committees included, first, the federal response to COVID-19 is chaired by Minister Freeland. And the initial reaction in the first months, especially of the pandemic, was really on procurement. So the COVID-19 Supply Council was created to do that. And also simultaneously, through the Chief Science Advisor, we've seen investments in finding a vaccine. So the expert panel was tasked to do that. And now we are more seeing the response in terms of the Industry Council and the Green Economic Stimulus Plan for spending on climate change, clean technologies, and also infrastructure. Next slide, please. As Dave alluded with a very nice picture, virus really hit the economy, and it started off as a health pandemic, but over time, the more and more we saw the impact, it really turned into an economic crisis. And the critical component or the feature of this virus is that it hit both the businesses and the households. which means both the supply side and the demand side of the economy. But we've seen a massive response from the federal government directly supporting, also providing tax support for businesses at a magnitude of $168 billion. And also for households, the demand side of our economy, $131.5 billion of support. And part of that money went for public health, $25.3 billion, and that includes the research component as well. Overall, we see a picture of about $1 trillion of support from the federal government, including the indirect liquidity support. Next, please. When we compare the current COVID-19 budgetary response to previous 5 years of budgets, it is astonishing. It's more than 23 times larger than budget 2019, which accounts for about 2.5 decades of normal budgets combined in this one particular year. Next one, please.
Omer, can I just make a comment? We can go back to that last slide. Yeah, so the point here is that already, in terms of the federal approach, and we're only partway through the year, there's been about $325 billion in new spending, which is, on average, a high average, accounts for about 23 normal budgets that you would have spread over 23 years. So the issue it raises is, what are we doing in terms of future generations and limiting their ability to have effective government services? Are we going to be able to afford them in so many areas? And the final point is that the amount we've spent so far is just in terms of managing the crisis. The speech from the throne has set forward other new expenditures just to manage the crisis. We have not yet dealt with the issue of support that's going to be needed to get the economy fully functioning and back up. So those numbers are going to be even higher. I just wanted to mention that, Omer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I will go through it fairly quickly because we have some 20 minutes left for our portion of the presentation. Next one, please. So here is the COVID-19 impact map that we developed over the last 6 months, and it has the key components of our economy, including the federal government, provincial government, higher education sector, not-for-profits, the granting councils, private sector, Canadian households, and the global markets, which are the demand side of the equation. And it's really detailed on in terms of the assessment of the impact on the larger, broader economy. Next one, please. How about the R&D component of this response? According to our analysis, out of the total direct federal support of $240 billion, we see $1.6 billion spent for research and development as part of the emergency response plan. Next one, please. Here are a quick picture of the granting councils and third-party organizations in the context of COVID-19. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but what I want to allude here is that some 7 perhaps key organizations are tasked to respond to COVID-19 through support from the federal government in this process. That includes NSERC, Genome Canada, MyTax, Futurpreneur, CFAR, and CFI. Next one, please. And support for SMEs. There's massive support for Canadian SMEs. The CEUs and the CEBA, the 2 large programs you see on the left-hand side, are actually expanded yesterday with the speech from the throne. And that's actually an admirable situation because SMEs are really the backbone of our economy, and there is a lot of support directly going to SMEs in this period. Next one, please. And for provinces, I'm going to make 3 arguments here or observations based on the data that we found. Provincial debt is really increasing substantially. So that's going to be a pressing issue going forward because the provinces will have less opportunity to spend for their provinces. So there is an increased debt for each province. When we look at the GDP contraction, especially in Newfoundland and Alberta that we have identified, GDP will contract across the whole economy, across all the provinces with no exception. And lastly, the provinces actually have responded to the pandemic by providing $66 billion in direct and liquidity measures to support their communities in this period. Next one, please. And for higher education, it's about 2.4% of our economy, but it produces the talent for 100% of economic activity. And that's actually very critical to look at the pipeline of our talent. On the other hand, unemployed Canadians, the number was 5.5 million in April. Now, still there's 1 million jobs that needs to be created to keep Canadians employed. And the higher education equation, just to emphasize the importance of this area and how it is actually producing the talent needed for all economic activity in our country. Next one, please. And here are some of the key issues that we've identified to consider, and they are under 3 categories. So issues affecting institutions, higher education institutions, issues affecting students, and issues affecting research. In the left-hand side, for example, potential reduction in public funding and pressure on budgets, and international students fee from them will potentially reduce as well. And also organizational restructuring to respond to changing student needs is some of the key issues affecting institutions today. In terms of effects or impacts on students, we may see some loss of benefits of campus-based education, face-to-face interaction, network and socialization in this period of remote kind of learning environment. And now the students are also to some extent taking more control of their own learning. So this situation is greatly affecting them. And in terms of the research aspect, we may see possible decreases in federal R&D support because there may be some measures to reduce spending. And lastly, the point I want to make is about the national priorities. So federal need going forward for R&D will shape towards meeting the national priorities that we have. Next one, please. And here are some of the key risks that the institutions may need to manage going forward. And we have four buckets of that. And one of the key risks that we've identified is the quality and benefits of higher education and the risk of reduction in this kind of quality and benefits. So we need to keep it up. And the second one is as mentioned, pressures on budgets. And that probably needs more collaboration between institutions. We're already seeing that happening in some part of our higher education sector. So that's actually good news, but it's really a survival mode at this stage. The third point is the potential reduction in research budgets, similar kind of argument on the pressures on the budgets. And lastly, the outputs that we produce for our economy, both nationally and provincially, may be constrained going forward for reasons such as fewer graduates and so on. Next one. Yeah, so we looked at data from CAUBO and StatsCan sources, looking at, well, what are the revenues and expenditures of our institutions, higher education institutions, and whether these business models are sustainable. For universities and degree granting colleges, the profit margins seemed very small. And for community colleges and vocational schools, we found basically no profit. So if we also look at the revenue breakdown, so well, where is this revenue coming from? Most of this support is coming from provincial and municipal budgets funding, and then the tuition and other fees. So both of these are hugely impacted by COVID-19. Next, please. Again, just to reinforce the argument about international students, we actually have almost 300,000 post-secondary enrollments as international students over from 200 countries. Now we have the travel restrictions and also if a student comes here but doesn't really have that interaction with other students or professors, that seems to be a significant challenge going forward. And when you look at the revenue from these tuitions alone from international students, is estimated at $6 billion. So if you remember the last slide, the profit margin was such small, $1 billion, and the impact that the international students are having is huge. So this is another key issue that we need to consider. Next one. And yeah, so when we look at the federal support for R&D at universities and colleges, we don't see much actually for colleges, and there may be need going forward, considering the practical need for R&D applied research going forward. I think the colleges may have a bigger role going forward than they have today. So more investments may be needed for college support, R&D support from the federal government.
Omer, let me I'll do the business industry sector.
Sure,
okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, the first point here is that have a look at the companies on the left-hand side: Bombardier, Cineplex, the Ford Motor Company, Reitman, Cirque du Soleil, Leon's, WestJet. Really significant layoffs in terms of the unemployment problem that Canada had. And as Omer mentioned earlier, about 5.5 million Canadians were unemployed or were only working about part-time, 50% of the time. Now those numbers have changed. The economy has rebounded, but there's still, as many, well, in fact, more than 1 million people that are unemployed that want to be employed. And that's why in the speech from the throne, the government really targeted this particular issue. Next slide. Here we're looking at the top businesses in Canada on the right-hand side that fund research and development. And what's interesting is, aerospace and aviation, auto parts, oil and gas, again, Pratt & Whitney, aerospace, aviation. These are all industries that have been fundamentally affected by COVID-19. There's no question in my mind that there's going to be a deterioration in the research and development programs, and in part some of the funding of universities that is associated with these kinds of programs. Next slide. So in looking at the kind of impact on industry, every industry was affected. I'm sure all of us were. Hardest hit industries: retail, tourism, airlines, energy sectors. And it's interesting that the government has already responded by creating strategic strategy tables for the retail and for the tourism sectors, which I think is probably important. We're all dealing with supply chains. We're actually doing work for global affairs and looking at these. Every business has had to reassess its strategy. And in terms of the longer term, unless you really get an effective vaccine and it's known to be effective and you get Canadians to take it, you're not going to get back to this normal kind of structure of business operations. In the interim, we've seen the expansion of the digital businesses of all descriptions. And actually, if you look at stock market evaluations, many of the digital suppliers, Amazon, Google, Apple and so on are really increasing quite phenomenally, their sales. So an uneven impact on industry, but our concern is really small business. Trade and investment. So how was this affected? Go to the next slide. Here I think we've increasingly realized that Canada really is very much alone in this very, very scary and competitive world. We can't rely as much as we did in the past on the United States in terms of our trading relationships. We've renegotiated NAFTA in effect, but we've had new restrictions threatened on aluminum. Our whole relationship with China really is called into question. We've got the UK actually going through Brexit and an unknown trade relationship there. We've tried to get a seat on the Security Council and have failed in accomplishing that. So I think we're recognizing that, look, Canada is not this well-loved little beaver around the world. We're going to have to be tougher and smarter than we have been in the past. Next slide. Next, yep. Here we have I think what is no surprise in terms of the drastic reduction that took place as a result of basically a shutdown of most businesses. A deep 20, almost a 30% decline in April in terms of merchandise exports. The trade deficit grew from about 900 million to 3.3 billion in April. So that kind of trend is bouncing back, but the shock was really quite stunning and we have not fully recovered from that. Next slide. One of the things we keep having, I think need to remember is that we're really a very, very small market. If you're just looking at serving the Canadian market, 37.6 million of us. So we've got to be a nation of traders, looking at Mexico, the US, European Union, India, and China. But as mentioned, we've got challenges in terms of our relationships with China and with the United States right now that are going to have a long-term impact, I would suspect, in terms of our trading capability. Next slide. If you look at, well, what do we trade? So this is a summary of all of our merchandise exports, and you can see the GHG dependent nature of our energy exports and motor vehicles and parts. So this amounts to at least a third of the Canadian exports, which I think are called into question now longer term as we look at the transition to a greener economy. And again, in the speech from the throne, the government wants to advance that. So what's going to replace those exports is the question that I have. Next. When you look at, well, who are our largest trading partners? And I've outlined our 3 largest trading partners in red, United States, and look at the challenges that we're having right now, the uncertainty in terms of what will happen, no matter whether you have a Republican administration or a Democratic administration in the US. We have major issues that we need to sort through there. The EU is affected primarily by the UK and Brexit. And in terms of China, we have quite an abrupt decline in terms of our exports and our imports with China until we settle a very, very fundamental range of issues with them. So not an optimistic picture. Next. In terms of services exports, devastating impact in terms of tourism, travel, transportation sector. And again, these are very, very large, over 1/3 of our exports were certainly at risk there and will remain so in the future. Next slide, please. Impact on households. One of the issues that we really need to understand better is we were all locked down, and the households actually represent about 60% of total demand in Canada in terms of purchases. And when we were locked down, people were worried. Some of them were really affected in terms of not knowing if they were going to have employment. Could you pay your mortgage? What about bankruptcies were happening? There was obviously a loss of consumer confidence. So a remarkable decline in terms of public spending at that point in time, and we all went online to order in food and other kinds of products. And even currently, we have this uncertainty surrounding our education system, and are our kids going to get a cold and therefore have to be locked down for 14 days along with us? So these kinds of uncertainties are prevalent and are going to affect consumer demand. Next. Yeah, I won't go into this, but these are the components of consumer demand. And as you look at this, transportation was affected enormously. In terms of household operations affected. In terms of clothing and footwear, you've seen the evidence from stores that, people aren't buying pants, they're buying, pajamas and leisure kind of clothes because all they have to do is, put on a clean shirt and they can go on Zoom. So there's a restructuring of consumer demand, but it is declining overall. Next. Among the household sector, the thing that concerns me the most is youth unemployment. These rates have gone through the roof. So there's youth employment in general, which is extraordinarily high, and then student unemployment, which is even higher. And I think we need to make a special effort to understand what can be done to ensure that a generation of Canadians are going to get employment and the employment experiences that they need. Next slide. The background for this as well is all of these technologies, the Internet of Things, 5G, quantum computing, synthetic biology, AI, that are about to hit us, which are possibly going to have an impact in terms of increased job losses. Certainly new kinds of skills and new jobs are going to be required. And in addition, there are issues about privacy and ethics that need to be settled in relation to these technologies. We've ignored these a little bit because of the pandemic. It's understandable, but I think we need to get back on track. Now, the road ahead. So how are we going to deal with these issues? One of the things I think we need to start with is a better understanding of the Canadian economy. Here you have on the horizontal axis the total employment in terms of the 4 major sectors of the Canadian economy. And on the left-hand side, the size of that economic activity. And you can see that the service sector dwarfs everything in terms of employment and in terms of GDP. If you're going to create so many new jobs, how are you going to do that? Now, the speech from the throne, the government is talking about a lot of construction in terms of home retrofits and so on that hits that sector. But what about manufacturing sector? What are we going to do? What about the energy natural resource sector? And then what about key components of the service economy? Next. The current approach, as you know, we have these economic strategy tables. A couple have been added to as a result of COVID-19, and we have this supercluster kind of structure. These are new organizations that are trying to find their way, and one of the issues is how are they going to develop in further to be able to support economic growth. Next slide. One of the things that we need to bear in mind is that we have had 6 less than stellar attempts to support innovation and commercialization strategies going back to 2002. I mean, Alan Rock, Joe Rotman, Jim Flaherty had one. We had the Tom Jenkins one. Then we had Ed Holder. Then we had the Baines-Barton one, the 2017, which is the current structure. I have no doubt that we're going to need a new one. Not just because of COVID-19, but because of the earlier argument that we really have not been performing well, and who will actually be the minister in charge of putting that together. Next slide. One of the fundamental issues is, do we structure our support for research and innovation along the traditional sectors of, agri-food, health, life sciences, manufacturing, defense and security, transportation, etc., or do we do it in a different way by looking at horizontal technologies that can affect every sector? So this would be the AI, big data analytics, cyber, clean tech. Obviously, the government is doubled down on that. Genomics, synthetic biology, robotics, augmented reality. These are choices that the government has that we can influence and we may have views on. Next. In summary, one of the key elements that I want to make the argument for here is that I think we need to integrate 4 Canadian strategies as we look at economic development and the role of research and innovation in coming out of the pandemic. Which industry sectors are priorities? The government is signaling green and digital, which I think are excellent. Smart manufacturing should be there, and obviously natural resources. And then we need to, because of the size of the Canadian market, it's so small, we need to look at, well, what markets are we going to sell into? And some of our traditional markets are presenting problems with us right now. What new markets might we try and target? Then when we've understood that, how are we going to innovate? Is it startups, scale-ups? Is it invention or technology adoption? Goods versus services, and sectors versus tech platforms. Once we decide that, what are the new skills we're going to need to be able to perform the innovation that is needed to make us effective in these new markets? And some of these skills are obviously digital in nature. We need to understand how to manage networks, collaborative networks, collaborative research networks better. We need training and understanding better about the importance of diversity management, and then sales and marketing. The central idea here, though, is to make permanent the economic strategy tables. They should be composed of business, governments, and academia, made permanent, and look at all of these 4 areas of strategy together in terms of developing a plan forward. Next slide, please. This is the final component, looking at new directions from the speech from the throne. This is a slide that I have used in the past to raise the question in terms of previous budgets, the 2 previous budgets from the Liberal government, which in our analysis, we do a detailed analysis, focused about 80% on security and consumption, so social security and protecting social networks, as opposed to very little given to economic growth. I call into question whether or not you can have a well-performing society unless you have the ability to pay for it, and that means getting enough balance in terms of supporting economic growth. I was pleased to see that in a number of the editorials this morning, including the Globe and Mail, that people are pointing out the same issue in terms of the speech from the throne. Do we have the right balance? And that's an open question for people to decide for themselves. Next slide. And Omer, do you want to just take us through this briefly, please?
Yeah, very quickly, I will. So the new approach announced yesterday is really based on 4 foundations. So I'm gonna go over in one minute or so. The first one is health is the priority. There's no second question about that. Effectively dealing with that is the best thing we can do for the economy was one of the statements. Focus on the critical equipment, but also have a vaccine strategy to ensure we get the vaccine when it's developed. The second one is creating over 1 million jobs is the critical component of that. Scaling up youth unemployment and skill strategy and action plan for women in the economy. So this foundation is around supporting people and businesses through the crisis at whatever cost, basically, and whatever, how as long as it lasts and whatever it takes. And also it was an interesting statement to see that it's not the time for austerity. Next one. The third foundation is building back better. This is more closer to the economy and industry side. I'll go pretty quickly. The resiliency agenda for the middle class. Number 2, 3, infrastructure, including broadband. Number 4, food insecurity, local supply chains. Number 5, largest investment in Canadian history in training for workers. We had to see that. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on the environment, clean tech, natural resources. And 11 was blue economy, supporting ocean economy to create opportunities. And last slide is the next one, standing up who we are as Canadians is the fourth foundation. Focus on the multilateral relations and as well as bilateral. Eliminate the pandemic everywhere so we help internationally. Migrants must be brought home and promote free trade. So that was the fourth foundation. And in conclusion, maybe the next slide, I can allude that. So we looked at this this survey by the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses and what they want from the speech from the throne. And what we've seen, about 4 of the 10 kind of requests are met. And it includes invest in Canada's ability to manage COVID-19, that's in the SFT. Increase investment in core infrastructure, we see that. A recovery plan focused specifically on making the economy greener, that it's in the plan, and also changing Canada's social safety net to make it more generous, again in the plan. However, we haven't seen a more competitive tax environment for small businesses, neither a broad-based recovery plan. So in our opinion, it was absent in the speech from the throne. I'm going to stop here myself, but Dave, please.
And Omar, just to add the other two, keeping government spending under control. And again, no time for austerity. There really was no plan that was mentioned there in the speech from the throne or for dealing with regulatory issues. So the final slide. So this is it. We're going to end with this. 3 questions for the audience. Does Canada need an integrated post-COVID R&D innovation, industrial trade and skills strategy? I think they should be integrated, but maybe other people have different views that they shouldn't be, or maybe they think we don't need one at all. If we do need it, who could lead in developing it? And part of the issue there is, should it be led by government or should it be led by other institutions in society? And a third question, would your organization commit time and resources to assisting in developing such an integrated strategy? So those are certainly questions for the audience. I want to thank you, Meredith, for the opportunity to make a presentation in terms of our R&D innovation system, the impact of COVID-19, and what some of what the road might look like as we try and recover the economy. And I absolutely look forward to views from our discussants.
If I'm not muted, can you hear me? Excellent. Yes. Thank you very much, Dave and Omar, for this excellent presentation. I guess that was, I think I can speak on behalf of the participants, that was the blown away our mindset and our understanding of the ecosystem. It was an excellent presentation and we learned a lot and raised a lot of questions. And I just want to ask the CSPC office, to the extent that they can, you may want to chat with Omar to see if you can get those 3 questions and put them in the poll. During the remaining time, we can ask the participants to answer those questions and they get the responses live and send them back to Dave Waters for further action on that. And so that was very good, Dave. Only 8 minutes over time, which is a record for your presentations, I guess. That was very good. I appreciate that. And it was excellent content. Everybody wanted to continue, I'm sure about that. And now I think we have, we are going to our discussant. And before that, just very quickly, I would like to introduce them. Meantime, I want to ask our CSPC office to launch our first question. This is the CSPC question, a survey to the participants. We want to know which sector you are representing and you're coming from. Please answer that question, and we appreciate it. Helps us for future programming. And that's good. Now, going to Karen Young, Chief Executive Officer of Futurpreneur. She served 7 years at Mars prior to Futurpreneur as Vice President for Corporate Development and Partnership. She oversaw strategy development and implementation while building relationships with government and stakeholders and other tenants and ecosystem partners, including Futurpreneur. Previously, she served as a strategy and finance managing roles in nonprofit management in San Francisco, New York, and London and in UK with various organizations, including Bain & Company and The Gap. Over to you, Karen, the CEO and President of Futurpreneur. How do you see Dave's presentation, and what is your take on that, and what is your analytical viewpoint?
Thanks so much, Mehrdad and Dave and Omar. I think I want to just set the stage for my comments in that I often describe Futurpreneur as being the ED and ISED. So we work with small businesses. We've been helping young entrepreneurs age 18 to 39 start small businesses for over 20 years. In fact, we've helped over 11,000 of them. More of them are Main Street businesses. Some of them, and I'll share one story in particular, are also innovative, but we're that economic development side of the equation as well, which Dave and Omar really touched on at the end of their presentation. I mean, when we look at where we are today, what we're seeing is a challenge in the heart and soul of our Main Street businesses. By protecting people, we're shutting down businesses or making it harder for them to operate. And that has an untold toll on Canada and our economy. And a lot of what we heard about yesterday was how to mitigate that toll. I'll share a statistic with the audience. We at Futurpreneur, we actively have about 3,000 clients, and again, have supported over 11,000. A subset of these clients recently let us know how they've been impacted by COVID-19, and 70% of them had seen significant economic impact or closure as a result of the pandemic. So what I was listening for yesterday and what I was listening for in Dave's presentation and Omar's presentation was, what are some of the things that the government's doing to resolve some of these challenges? And I'm going to refer to Dave's two of his three uns. I love that framework. In particular, the uneven impact and the unprecedented uncertainty that we're seeing. And I think that that's really one of the challenges that I was happy to hear addressed in the throne speech. In particular, first and foremost, the continued wage subsidy. The fact that not only will businesses be supported in continuing to operate and continuing to employ their workers, but that they now have 9 months of visibility and runway that is going to be the case. That really is very vital for them in planning. And I know the wage subsidy has been incredibly important for many of our clients. It's also very good to hear that the government is rethinking and looking at expanding SEBA, the Emergency Business Account. I will say that some of those gaps have been hard for businesses to address, and we were very grateful to receive some government funding that helped us address that gap for some of our clients in the first couple of months of the pandemic. I was also very happy to hear the reference to embracing a Quebec-style early childhood education and early learning and childcare framework across the country. And this really speaks to that uneven impact in that women in particular, but also people from groups facing barriers, people from Black, Indigenous communities and communities of color are more likely to be working in essential services. They're less likely to have the kinds of resources that can make sure that they can do so safely and continue to work in a safe way. And they're often, and we've seen this in the statistics, they've been the most impacted by COVID. So hearing that there's a possibility of having that government support for children, which will help workers, men and women, it does disproportionately fall on women, and it disproportionately falls on communities of color, helps them be able to meaningfully engage and work is important. One thing that I found missing in the speech from the throne, is a revisiting of the rent coverage. I think that's one of the big barriers that so many businesses are facing. And I would say the current solution was very well intended, but the uptake, what we hear anecdotally is that too many businesses don't have access to that rent support. But here's the good news. Entrepreneurs are by their nature problem solvers, and that goes for small business owners. And they have been spending months trying to solve problems. And in many ways, I think the government has been working to support that. And I'll give one example in particular. Futurpreneur years ago supported a company in Waterloo called Inksmith. And Inksmith sells 3D printers and robotics kits aimed at the education market. They were one of many Canadian companies this spring that pivoted completely in the face of COVID-19. You may now know them as Canadian Shield. They are they're actually supplying 2/3 of the 16 million face shields that the government has procured for safety. And in fact, they're donating $750,000 to teachers and school systems across the country. So Canadian Shield's a great example of Canadian resilience and industry resilience. They've gone from 10 to over 250 employees really quickly. So they're giving good jobs, keeping people safe, innovating, selling into the markets here. And again, an example of government procurement. I think one of the themes that Dave and Omer brought up is procurement. And we need government not only to play a role in supporting innovation, but a key part of innovation is commercialization, and a key element in commercialization is being able to sell domestically and being able to sell to the largest market, the largest consumer in Canada, which is the federal government. So I'll leave that there. Obviously, lots of time for questions now, and I can't wait to hear from Irene as well.
Thank you very much for your comments, Karen. And I want to ask my colleagues at CSPC to launch the second survey about the geographic distribution of the participants in this session. And I appreciate if you could answer to that question. And also, I just want to raise the point that we have already received 23 questions from the participants. All of them are exciting. Please feel free to vote up any question that reflects yours, or you like that for various reasons. That helps us to kind of order the questions based on how participants favored those questions. We go through them on that order. And now going to Irene Sterian. Thank you, Irene, for being with us in this session. Irene is the founder and CEO of Manufacturing Acceleration Process Network, or REMAP, a 25 million innovation accelerator jointly funded by the business-led network of Center of Excellence program and its partners. Irene started her engineering career at IBM and then later on joined Celestica in 1994 and had numerous managing roles in the firm until she founded the REMAP. Irene, over to you for your views on Dave's presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. First of all, thank you very much, Dave and Omer, for your presentation and for summarizing the last 6 months post-COVID, including the last 24 hours with the speech for the throne. It was really a great summary. And I'd like to discuss some of the points that you mentioned from my perspective from the REMAP network, which is really not-for-profit. And what we're really doing is trying to bridge the commercialization gap and take products to market faster. And we don't want to leave anybody behind, especially SMEs. So from a manufacturing point of view, 99% of Canadian manufacturers represent SMEs. So I have kind of a manufacturing affinity and bend of what my comments are. But first of all, I'd like to make kind of 3 general comments. The first one being that the government was very fast at responding to COVID-19. I was almost shocked at how quick everything was and all the supports that were put in place. So that was very good. The second thing, and I think you mentioned that, was the funding for COVID-19 products and services. There was, I think, 80 new initiatives you mentioned in your summary. I think everybody right now is suffering from COVID-19 proposal exhaustion. There was a lot of proposals being put in place, but very few of the companies that put in proposals actually got funding. So if we were to do something better going forward into sort of the new strategy tables, would be to streamline how we do this and how we leverage not just pivot kind of initiatives, but also new initiatives for new business. And the last thing is I want to echo what you were saying about Canada being really good at doing academic research, and we probably get an A+ mark on that, but really not very good at doing commercialization. And we probably we get a C for commercialization. And this has been exacerbated by the supply chain issues recently. And one example of that is making PPE masks. And companies like Mayan, for example, who can develop the mask and the product, did not have a lab in Canada to go to do the viral testing. And it was suddenly obvious in March 2020 that we were lacking some of that supply chain infrastructure, and we had to go to the US. So fortunately, some labs have stepped up since and have created bridges in those supply chain gaps. But I think supply chains in general and developing things or doing research and development without the supply chain to back it up is an issue. So next, I'd like to address some of the more specific items. I don't know if you can go back to slide number 4. In your presentation, I think, Omer. But my comment there is around research and development. And from my opinion, it was delayed by at least 6 months. So both academia delays and industry delays, especially in aerospace and in automotive. I think the good news about automotive is that EVs are starting to gain interest again due to a circular economy. And most recently, Ford, GM, and Tesla all made announcement around EVs and EV chargers, including Jeff Don from Dalhousie University, and he's leading the way with Tesla research. But this is an area of research that can be expanded in Canada around the green economy and the circular economy. Another comment I want to make is that manufacturing kept going, and product development and process development kept going through March, the last 6 months. They haven't stopped. So the main focus was on employee safety and security on stable supply chain. It really wasn't a focus on R&D. Some companies were able to pivot and create new lines of business, and they didn't need R&D for that purpose. And they repurposed some of their equipment, so maybe there was some development required. But a lot of it was around safety, security, and pandemic needs. Long-term R&D usually occurs in academic institutions. Takes 3 to 5 years out. Those solve longer term problems, has not really been the focus in the short term, and probably not be the focus in the next 6 months either. Among the top 100 R&D firms in Canada, if you look at who's doing R&D, there's 26 that are in pharma and biotech. There's 22 in manufacturing, and I kind of speak for those 22. So R&D in manufacturing also gets a C. There isn't a lot of, I would say, effort put into the manufacturing. And I think Dave mentioned that we rank 13th in the OECD in terms of R&D. So I think we are laggards in R&D in the manufacturing sector as well. And the other thing around R&D is that R&D positions changed, especially for students in universities and colleges. They were affected because they had to do the R&D work remotely. The labs were closed or partially opened. And the limited access to that, I would say, has created a 3 to 6 month gap in where we need to catch up. And I would say, luckily for us, from a REMAP point of view, we have some additional funding from the government for student support to continue that research, which is definitely needed and appreciated. The other comment I want to make was around slide number 21. And the comment is really around accelerating digitization. And to me, that has been like the one big thing. What companies were planning to do in the last 3 years, they probably did in the last 3 months. And there was an even bigger divide, I would say, between SMEs that had already digitized and ones that didn't. The ones that could pivot very quickly and address healthcare products were the ones that were already digital. As Karen mentioned, you know, the Canadian Shield is one of those great examples of a digital company. The other thing is design and manufacturing have to be tighter, closer together. So you can't just say manufacturing, it has to be design and manufacturing. And from a supply chain point of view, again, I cannot stress enough the problems in the supply chain. And another example that we lived live is making ventilators and Starfish Medical. And Starfish tried to design a new ventilator so as not to pull from the existing supply chain of constrained parts, where companies like Medtronic were already trying to build ventilators. Starfish Medical out of British Columbia designed a ventilator old school with knobs and dials, not a touch screen, because that did not strain the supply chain. But finding those parts in Canada or North America is very difficult right now. And again, a gap in how we design and manufacture together. So I think in conclusion, I would say the shifting priorities for the next, I'd say the end of 2020, there are probably three things. Number one, again, is employee health and safety. And remote work is not an option for somebody making physical products. The second thing is really maintaining consistent day-to-day operations given social distancing. And then the last thing is meeting customer expectation given the supply chain challenges. Those are the top three priorities from a manufacturing point of view. So from an R&D point of view, I'd say the R&D, the D will be much bigger in the short term than the R. The TRL scale, the TRL 1 to 9 scale, there will be TRL 4 to 8 activity. And again, I agree with Dave in terms of colleges have to be given a much bigger piece of the pie in that there's a lot of development work that needs to be done going forward. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene, for this excellent coverage and presenting your critical comment on Dave's presentation. And at this point, apparently, just want to inform you that Zoom functionality could not allow us to put those questions into the poll because we need multiple choices. Instead, our office is going to copy those questions in the chat line. Please feel free to copy them. Send us the response to info@sciencepolicy.ca, or right now, you can copy and paste your response into the Q&A box. These will be captured and will be publicized later on. So we have 25 questions, and I'll go through some of them. Hopefully, we can answer as many as possible. Dave, the questions are to you and to Omer, but Karen and Irene, please feel free, and we ask you, please, to comment if anywhere that you think it's appropriate and you want to answer those questions. The first question by Jeff Kinder, liked by 5 people, but why expect private sector firms to invest more in R&D and innovation when they haven't been for decades? Time for a different approach. Public purpose missions a la Muzakato that drive Canadian innovation in response to a grand challenge. Dave, your response to that?
I think I would agree with Jeff. In other words, getting some national challenges in place, for example, in terms of the speech from the throne and a focus on the green economy. And the green economy affects every part of the economy. So it isn't just a segment by itself. It's one of these horizontal kind of areas. But then what the government has to do is something that it would appear that they're going to be doing or mentioned in the speech from the throne. The tax rates then. If you get into producing green technology, if I understand it correctly, the speech from the throne said, well, your tax rate might be reduced by half, the corporate tax rate. Terrific. That's exactly the kind of thing that you want to see a government do. In other words, one of the things that I've learned from this, and as you know, my background in part from the Department of Finance, I'm astounded at how much money has been spent. When I think of the challenges that I've known institutions and organizations have faced in getting money from government, money does not seem to be an issue for this government. And so in terms of the costs of that kind of tax benefit that you might get for investing in green technology or for another particular economic challenge, clearly there might be fiscal room to be able to do that. So the idea of the, sort of the grand challenges and then some of the support measures that might be needed. I mean, we've seen, actually it was interesting, Irene, you referred to some of the subsidies for students. We took on 4 students this summer, in part because of the initiative the government put into place to give a partial subsidy for them. That's all that businesses need to be able to take resources and then align them and assign them for a particular area. A final comment might be that there's been some suggestions about patent pools, that if you're getting a certain amount of your revenue from a patent, that you tax it differently, you tax it lower. So I think there are ways of combining these strategic areas the government wants to see developed and the practical measures in terms of direct support and tax support to permit businesses to pursue them.
Any comment from Irene and Karen? Anyone? We can move on.
Yes,
okay.
I wanted to add,
Yes.
The Ontario Green Energy Act was an example of that, where Ontario required 70% local content for solar module manufacturing. And that was all that was really stated. But that really drove investment of German companies and solar companies from Germany into Canada and into Ontario specifically. It's just to me the comment of making the right business climate environment, because businesses are global today and they make decisions based on sourcing, based on favorable government incentives.
Thank you. By the way, the questions added to the chat line, and please feel free if you want to respond to info@sciencepolicy.ca, or here in the chat box, you can write responses. Omer?
Just a quick comment. I would also agree with the approach of a public purpose R&D and having a grand challenge to achieve, to solve. And unfortunately, I didn't see one. To me, it's a very critical component of our economy. I haven't seen that in the speech from the throne. Is the cybersecurity issue. I mean, cyber attacks cost us tens of billions of dollars a year, and I think it's one of the grand challenges even today, but also going forward. So that may be another area that we could target in terms of keeping our digital infrastructure secure, and we are increasingly working remotely using digital devices, and that's, I think, one of the key challenges that we are facing today. We will be facing in the future too.
I hope that your answers become shorter, and so that we can get to more questions. But as a follow-up to that similar question by Jeff Passmore, why do more R&D when we cannot and don't commercialize what we R&D already? I think Canada has an R&D backlog, and we should invest, focus on tax policies, not programs that result in commercialization. Any additional comments to that, Dave?
Well, I think you have to take a systems approach. So if you're looking at a national economy and the role of governments in that economy, they have the levers which are spending, tax, regulation, and then I think as Karen, you mentioned procurement as being some of the essential mechanisms that can incent activity in a certain direction. What you need, though, is a decision by an economy, by a society. Well, what are our priorities? What kind of goods and services do we want, or do we want to export to then be able to afford the kind of society that meets the kind of standards and values that we want? So the different tools, I think, are necessary, and research and development to me is just one key component. Its function is to acquire new knowledge that then can give you an edge as it is used in the production process or in the design of new goods and services.
Okay. And Tim Norris asks, governments have invested heavily in R&D at universities and in granting councils, etc. But our smart people, IP, and great startups all rapidly move to USA and global centers when our SMEs hit 20 staff and they sell out for big cash. As a result, Canada's taxpayers are subsidizing the Silicon Valley with little value in economic growth. US and global branch plants don't invest in R&D. Not sure that's true, but how do we recreate the Nortels of old?
Can I take that one? I think we've got a lot of things. I think we have a lot of examples of that not happening, actually, and it's really promising. We have examples of companies actually doubling down in Canada, consciously making the decision to reinvest, employ their teams here, have their employees here, and then to reinvest in the ecosystem. I mean, Shopify is an extraordinary example where they are primarily in Canada. They've grown to significant scale, and a lot of their innovations are actually going into helping Canadian companies sell in Canada and globally. So, I mean, that's one example. There are others. There's a company, IntelliJoint in Kitchener-Waterloo, that actually is a biomedical innovation company that actually started a biomedical innovation zone there to help other companies have the root system there. So I actually think that a lot of these Canadian innovators are taking it into their own hands and not selling out at 20 or 30 employees and going south, but rather staying here. And the more attractive we make this ecosystem for those entrepreneurs, the more of them will stay. There are so many more stories that I'd love to talk to whoever asked that question afterwards.
Thank you. Dave, any comment from you? And Irene, you're welcome to comment as well.
Just a brief comment. I mean, on the issue of leakage, so of intellectual property going south and of firms at a certain stage in their evolution going south, to me, this reinforces the fact that we need to have an integrated systems approach in terms of looking at what objectives we have for economic development, and then components in terms of trade and components in terms of research and innovation. You know, in other words, as a firm becomes a little bit successful and reaches a certain size, what other assistance might it need in order to develop further? And just very briefly, the Germans have an approach which is totally different from Canada. In Canada, in terms of IRAP or in terms of most of the major research organizations, you're working one-on-one with a company. Germany does it differently. A lot of their programs are working on collective IP that is then used. So they have an organization called AIF that has 50,000 Mittelstand SME members. The research is done collectively for components of the economy, and any firm in that particular sector can actually use the IP. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about and seeing if they might work in Canada.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add one more thing. I totally agree with what Karen is saying, and Dave as well. I'm working with companies right now which are startups in Silicon Valley and in the Boston area, and trying to attract them to come to Canada. And they're locating a second hub, a second headquarters in Ottawa or in Toronto as an example, because they see the R&D ecosystem in Canada very favorable to them.
Right.
Okay, that's good. I would love to ask this out of the scope of these questions. Do you deny that there is a trend that from the north, the expertise, IPs, personnel, and the companies going to the south of border? Is this a trend or it's not a trend? Yes and no.
Who are you asking us that question?
Yes.
I think it's less of a
my question, by the way.
I would say it's less of a trend than it used to be. And I think one of the reasons that they go south is that we just simply don't have enough money here. And I think we have some huge pension funds here that if they invested more in Canadian innovation and put more of their money in Canada, more of the companies could stay. Okay. Qualified, no.
Can I just give Karen, I personally love that answer. When I see the amount of pension money, which are Canadian workers being invested abroad, I understand they might get higher returns. I think they should look themselves in the face and think about, is this the right thing to do for Canadians? Let's invest in Canadian firms. Yeah.
It's the long game.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Next question, it's an interesting one by Michael Turner. I find it odd that the federal initiatives, apologies because the question is jumping. I found it odd that federal initiatives to increase liquidity to the tune of $686 billion for the BOCs, EDCs, BDCs has gone almost completely unnoticed by the media and analysis. What's your view on this? And do you see any risk in this compared to the probably $400 billion in debt, albeit a sizable bulk of BOCs buying off government and business bonds? Dave?
Excellent question, Michael. It's very likely that there aren't more than 20 economists in Canada that understand the nature of the transactions that are taking place there. So I understand the issue that the media doesn't really give it much attention. I mean, as you know, I mean, it's absolutely fundamental, as you hit a crisis like this, and institutions of all kinds, including provincial governments, because they're assisted by this, have liquidity kind of requirements and so on, and you need to rely on financial institutions, the Bank of Canada, and other major financial structures, including EDC and BDC, to be able to provide that liquidity. So it's absolutely essential, but to me, I'm not surprised that it has not received the much attention by people. I don't think there's a particular problem that I'm aware of. The bigger issue to me is we're about 1/3 of the way through this crisis, perhaps, and we've already spent $325 billion. How much more can we afford?
Okay, thank you. Can I ask CSPC office now launch the third question from CSPC about our performance and how did you like this session? We're not ending right now, but we just want to make sure capture as many audience for this question. Very much appreciate your response to this question. And so a question or comment maybe by Luc Lalonde from, he's quoting from Financial Times. Any policymaker, chief executive, or innovation champion who relies on R&D intensity and R&D budgets as a meaningful or usable metric to assess global competitiveness virtually guarantees shoddy analysis and distorted decisions. Few things reveal less about a company's ability to innovate cost effectively than its R&D budget. Why do innovation policymakers continue to equate our national innovation performance to our level of R&D investment? Dave, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think probably in two ways. The Global Innovation Index, which is one of the main sources that I quoted, looks at about 120 different factors. So it isn't just looking at amount of money spent on R&D or R&D intensity. So I disagree with the premise of the question. I think we need to obviously continue to get better. And if you look at the WIPO methodology supported by Cornell University and INSEAD, they continue to refine that methodology to try and get a better understanding of what inputs produce what outputs in terms of innovation performance. The overall issue of looking at, for example, the OECD, looking at R&D and R&D intensity, when you actually look at those structures and the data in relation to the performance of the economies, there would appear to be quite a significant correlation there. So it's not the only measure. It may not be an excellent measure, but I think it is a measure that is important. And I think continuing the GII kind of index may be a better approach because it's much more sophisticated in terms of creating a causal link that's understandable between inputs into research and innovation and outputs.
Yes, Karen?
I have a comment, but I want to defer to Irene if you had one first, because I tend to love these questions and jump in. Is that okay? So I'm not a science policymaker, which is great for Canada, but I am a CEO. And what I'd say is, for us, and we're not an R&D driven company, but innovation is people. I mean, our innovation is the growth mindsets that our teams and the entrepreneurs we work with bring. And I want to give a shout out to the person, to Erin Maxwell, who asked a question of me about my survey, saying, did you have any BIPOC respondents? Any Black, Indigenous, or people of color who responded? And we did. And you can look on the Q&A for my responses. But I think our greatest asset continues to be our people. And the more that we unlock and unleash ways for them to work and be innovative within organizations, which is why the wage subsidy is such a brilliant addition to the federal plan, is really important for Canada going forward.
This, can I just add one other word? I liked your comment very much. Another way of looking at the question that was asked is, I was trying to give an answer kind of from the top down in terms of how institutions are approaching this. If I look at it, how I approach this, I approach it, and Omar knows this, I like to ask my staff, how many experiments are you doing this week? That's what innovation is. It's trying something new. And then if at the end of the week it works, why don't we do more of that? It's proven to be effective. So innovation can be this complex economic kind of concept, or you can reduce it down to fundamentals, doing things better. Innovation is the history of civilization. That's what civilization is about, innovation. They're one and the same thing. And the essence of it is trying something that's a little bit different. I always like that scene from the film 2001, was it called? Where you had the, you know, there were the apes and so on and so forth, and they found some bones, and the guy is flapping this bone around, and then he realizes, wow, this could be a club, and you know, he begins to use it there. That, in effect, is an element of innovation. Maybe not the best innovation, but that's exactly what it is. So it's people and trying to do things better and experimenting.
Thank you. Irene, you want to add any comment?
Yeah, just in terms of metrics, I think R&D is not our metric. It's technology readiness level, products to market, and export out of Canada. So I think it's really, that's the measure. It's the measure of value. And R&D might be an ingredient of that. And we can, you know, subset our measurement pool into that. But to me and to our network, it's really, have you put a product to market in faster time than anyone else? And have you exported it out of Canada?
Thank you. We are at the end of official time of the session, but because there's so much excitement and so much still questions coming in, I want to ask the panelists, please, if that's okay, we continue for another 10 minutes, this session, if that's okay. Thank you. So on the same follow-up on what Karen and Dave, you said in response to previous question, here is a comment or question from Sina Farouzi. He's saying, in addition to research and development for major institutions, industries, I would like to ask about grassroots innovations, individuals and themes and groups, youth, garbage-based innovation that could be root of major shifts and innovation that we may be missing as we focus much more on big institutions and industries. How do you read that?
Well, Dave, but I'll give an answer. I'm sure Karen will have a view on this as well. You know, again, from a grassroots point of view, so innovation is doing things differently and better as measured by some standard, helping people better in some way, producing a better service to somebody, and it can be people doing the most common things. We used to, working in a large organization like the federal government, you would get these, directions, be more innovative. And I would always translate it down to, okay, what does this mean in terms of the mailroom? How is the mailroom supposed to be more innovative? Because unless you can translate these generalities down into a more efficient or effective way of sorting the mail, of getting it faster, and I know this goes back a number of years now, you're missing the point. So I agree that while you have the sophistication of institutions and governments using levers like tax policy and spending and procurement to incent innovation, it does come down to the point that Karen was making. It's about people and their desire to improve the service that they're offering to other people in their organization or outside the organization. And we're all engaged in that. So that we want to make sure that the lessons learned aren't just the lessons from sophisticated organizations or academia, but that we listen to indigenous populations, for example, in terms of things that they see about the environment and the loss of species and the impact of temperature and so on, and take that into account as we're trying to deal with these issues. And that's why diversity is so important in general for any organization. You want to make sure that the human experience that you have in your organization is broad ranging, so that tactile understanding of what is an improvement is quite comprehensive.
Yeah, I agree. I vehemently agree. And I think that having diversity of lived experience can help us have innovations that will impact people with multiple lived experiences. I mean, it's kind of that simple. I think the other thing, Dave, the example you gave earlier of if something happens that's really great, you kind of say, do more of that. The other thing that has to happen for innovation is that if something is tried and it isn't great, it doesn't actually work, there's no punishment for that. It's just, okay, what did you learn from it? What are you going to do differently next time? And that's, I think, it's sort of, you need to have a carrot on both sides or people won't feel encouraged to innovate and experiment. And there's also a challenge that leaders have to communicate to the organization, which is we can't try every idea because there's limited bandwidth. So every idea can't be tried, but we will try to foster an environment where certain ideas can be tried to innovate what the organization does, which could have huge impacts. I'd love to know who at Inksmith came up with the idea of becoming Canadian Shield and pivoting, and then making sure that there's no penalty for trying and doing your best and having it not work.
Excellent, thank you. Let me just make sure that I'm reading according to the order of the questions. Okay, slide on issues affecting research, why there is no emphasis on the need for applied R&D and building innovation production capacity, especially given likely chaos in supply chains from the US post their election.
I wonder if, I mean, I've got a view, but Irene, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on this, because I thought you gave an excellent kind of summary in terms of supply chains.
Yes, definitely. I think I look at the strategy tables and how can we make them stronger. So I think what we have today is R&D, and I think the question is around applied. And I think that was my comment about development, like research and development. We need to focus more on that part. So what we've already created, there needs to be a funnel. So I think it's Fraunhofer that said you need 2,100 ideas to bring one product to market. So those 2,100 ideas are in the front end of that funnel. But then once you have that one product, you need to iterate it more. And that's the applied research part. And I think we don't put enough focus on that. And I think a lot of that work ends up in colleges from a research and development point of view, but it's really applied research. So I would say if we can include that in the strategy tables specifically, and also if you look at the strategy tables, manufacturing is a silo, it's a vertical. I think it could also be a horizontal.
Thank you, Irene. Before going to the next question, I want to add a comment that if you like this conversation and discussion, there is so much of it at the upcoming Canadian Science Policy Conference, starting November 4th by pre-conference sessions and officially November 16th for a full week of 65 panel sessions live with excellent panelists from across the globe, actually from 5 continents. And you will immerse yourself into science and innovation policy discussions, and the registration page will be posted in the chat line. Please benefit from the early bird rate, which has just been extended, and a hugely reduced registration rate for a virtual conference. Now, the next question is, how would you structure tax incentives for businesses to do R&D differently? Is this the right focus, since we disproportionately rely on indirect support versus direct government support for innovation? And so far as I remember, Dave, this has been the question for the last 15 years. People have asked me these questions, and I don't know if there is any answer to that, please.
Well, yeah, maybe a couple of comments. One is inside the Department of Finance, the tax policy group are, they're like Kafka's Castle. They're separate, and the communication is rare between these wizards in tax policy and the rest of the department. But one of the interesting things about tax policy, from my point of view, as opposed to looking at a spending program takes a very long time to develop. You've got to test it. You've got to, I mean, look at the superclusters. And if you actually look at the spending profile initially and where they are, I think there was a study that I saw done recently. They're only about 15% of the way, whereas they should be about 60% of the way there. It takes time to have an impact through these measures where you're either creating an institution to deliver something like a supercluster, or you're trying to do it through government kinds of initiatives. Tax policy, on the other hand, you can say, as of July 1st, here's what is going to apply. You know, if you spend so much, you're able to get a credit in relation to it. So it can be very, very fast. And I think actually in terms of effectiveness, having that kind of certainty from the point of view of business is an asset as well. You know, I think it was, I'm not sure where, it might have been Irene that was noting, or it may have been you, Karen, about the number, these 80 programs, and about firms that are trying to access the COVID-19 kind of programs, and they're becoming sort of COVID tired in terms of applying for things. With the tax incentive, I mean, it's something clear. You go to your accountant, you claim the benefit, and it can be very, very fast. So I don't see any reason why you can't link this into things that you think you want to incent, like you know, expenditures in relation to the amount of money you're spending on research and development. Right now, of course, you can get the SHRED program. I have used the SHRED program in terms of developing software, fairly easy and effective, you know, to be able to do that. There are many programs like that that you could expand depending on the kind of activity that you want to incent. So I actually think it is quite a valuable approach that we could take.
Thank you. And we have approached 2:40, and I'm going to read two more questions, and that's the end of the program. There are so many exciting questions here, and I wish we could have more time to answer those. But the question from John Omura: in terms of providing human capital for Canada's future economic growth, an important role post-secondary institutions play is to provide a gateway for high-caliber international students to establish themselves in Canada. I think this should be given importance in Canada COVID recovery strategy. What do you think about that? Anybody?
But let me give one answer, and then Karen, I think this would be a great one to get your views on. I think this is extraordinarily important, and I think Canada has a real advantage here. So if the issue is in terms of attracting human capital into Canada from abroad, as well as obviously developing our own, but let's look at that particular issue. I think Canada has an advantage because of the way we have handled the crisis so far, and in terms of the stability of our society, certainly as compared to some of the issues we're seeing emerging in the United States today. So I think we have a branding approach that we could capitalize on to get even more talent into Canada. To me, my father was an immigrant to this country, so you know, maybe I'm a bit biased. I think that the talent that we could attract right now is stunning. And remember, this youth unemployment issue is all across the globe. There's so much talent there. There's talent that is uncertain about the nature of the education they're going to get. We should have a program that goes out and tries to attract the brightest and the best into Canada. That's the way in which I think one of the key elements to develop our future. But we should get Karen's view on this as well.
Karen, please, over to you. You are muted, Karen. Please unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Sorry, I did not mean to be muted. Sorry about that. So I myself am an immigrant to Canada very happily. I arrived here 12 years ago and I'm never leaving. I think there are two parts of it. So I completely agree in terms of the attraction of our higher education. What's vital though in that is that we don't just attract international students, but then we make it possible for them to stay. And that's the part where we could mess up and where I think we actually do a pretty good job. Once they've been here, we actually make it possible for them to then forge a life here. And so many of the amazing people I know in the innovation ecosystem originally came to Canada as students and then stayed. There's another part that I think people have underestimated, and I'm hearing a lot more about it, which is encouraging, is not just thinking about traditional education, college and university education, as the only training grounds for innovators. And we talked about human capital. I think we need to actually look not only at people with accreditations that they attained internationally before arriving in Canada and give more credit to that and think more openly about those accreditations, but we also have to look at equivalents or alternatives to traditional education, because there are people in Canada who have had barriers to traditional education, but they don't have barriers to having brilliant ideas and intellect and ability. And so I think the more employers, and we've just started doing this, are making opportunities available to people with either university or college degrees or equivalent experience or demonstrated experience, the more will open up the opportunities for our small but mighty population here. So, oops, you're on mute, Myrtle.
Any comment from your end?
Sorry,
The last
from
word
my
to you.
end. Yes. Actually, yes, I'm also an immigrant to Canada. English is my 5th language. And
Wow.
I would say I definitely support the education system as well as foreign students and foreign-owned startups, and the importance of diversity in our country as well as in our innovation ecosystem. I think right now what's difficult is how to attract the foreign students to a remote learning model, as our universities and colleges are COVID ready, but their remoteness, I think, may disturb some of those links. I think if we can, I would say, pivot our education system into something that's more attractive globally, we will attract those foreign students.
Thank you, Irene. We are at 2:45. This is the end of the program. The panel of immigrants. I am a proud immigrant, of course, as well in Canada. So this is the beauty of this country and nation that, welcome the new immigrants, the new talents, and provide the opportunity for them to grow and contribute to the country and to the society. It was an excellent conversation and discussion. I want to thank Dave, Omer, Karen, Irene. I think we should do more of these. And I want to highlight once again that the Science Policy, 12th Canadian Science Policy Conference is starting with the pre-conference sessions on November 4th. And will be full in place on November 16th to November 20th with more than 65 live panel sessions. Please register at the early bird session. Your questions will be noted, and hopefully we can, with some mechanism with Dave Waters' consultation, have some responses to those, publish it in summer or maybe another session of this type. Feel free to send your questions to your answers to the 3 questions Dave Water asked to info@sciencepolicy.ca. The questions are in the chat section of this box. I want to thank you, all of you, for your engagement, for your participation at this session, and wish you all the best and look forward to staying connected. Thank you.
Thank you, Merdad, and thank you very much to Karen and to Irene. Thank you very much, and thanks, Omer. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
All the
everyone.
best.
Take care.